Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Episcopal Parish's study of the Mosaic of Christian Belief, 2nd edition, by Roger Olsen. Throughout the past several weeks, we have been discussing key theology within the Christian tradition. The particular approach that we are taking in this class, in this book study, is reading the wide swath, the mosaic of Christian theology, because there are legitimate disagreements within it that have some real important outcomes to it. But the way we are discussing it is descriptive rather than prescriptive. I am describing what the theology looks like rather than telling you, prescribing to you what you should believe about it. And today, that is very important to remember when we talk about one of probably the most divisive areas of Christian theology, which is humanity. By the very nature of the subject, humanity is a complex theological area that still requires some very important and very careful thought as to how we understand humanity. Because in the practical way, what you think about humanity directly affects how you treat other people. If you view them as being essentially evil things, you will treat them a certain way. If you treat them as being an essentially good thing, you will treat them certain ways. When you see someone commit an act of evil, and you have a certain theological preconception about that, you will interpret it in certain ways, and praxeologically, you will then have certain justice adjudications that you will say are appropriate for the situation. And people of good faith have massive disagreements about this because we come from different perspectives on humanity. When we talk about humanity, within the Christian tradition, we have to be careful about our terminology. And one of the things that happens, my apologies, I'm going to pull up my notes here real quick. One of the things that happens when we talk about humanity is that we often are speaking the same terminology and are not meaning the same things. We're saying the same words, but when we get down to the nitty-gritty, we discover we are not talking in the same fashion. And I want to start by describing exactly some of those terms. So we're talking about humanity this morning. Some of the terms that get thrown around are really important to understand when we speak about this. One of those terms is nature. For example, many of us have probably run across a question that is a dichotomy. And this question is, are humans essentially good, or humans essentially evil? Or is human nature good or evil? Anybody hear that question before? Is human nature good or evil? This word right here, human nature, refers, in the way that I'm going to talk about it, human nature is going to refer to a capacity of will. It is not going to be referring to a capacity of substance. If that's confusing, you'll see why this is important in a moment. In human nature, what we are talking about is what are humans naturally drawn towards, in the way that I'm using it in parlance. So when we ask the question, is human nature good or evil? Rather, that's going to be a question of, is our will bent towards good things or evil things? Human nature, in the way that I use it this morning, and in the way that Olsen uses it, is not a question about human substance. It's not a question about human stuff. And it's important to get these two straight, because there are a diversity of opinions about the will, but there's a generally consensual tradition in Christianity about the substance, which you might find surprising. The will is the hard one to figure out here. The substance, though, in Christianity, we are pretty consensually clear on. And it even ranges throughout all of Christian history. But when we talk about human nature, we're talking about will, not substance, not the stuff we're made out of. So that's the first one we need to get clear. The second one that's really important about human nature is when we talk about human nature, one of the things we talk about is we talk about sin. And this is going to come up really importantly. The other term or phrase that we talk about is going to be one that some or most of us do not have a good understanding of. And it is the concept of original sin. Original sin is a much wider piece of theology than it probably might be in your head. Original sin, in the historical sense, was most widely made known by St. Augustine in the 3rd and 4th century. And St. Augustine had a particular way of explaining original sin. The concept of original sin, however, is much wider than St. Augustine. It's not simply an idea that St. Augustine had that the Western Christians held onto. Original sin is a much wider concept than just what St. Augustine said about it. And again, this will become very clear in just a moment. But what I want to say is that original sin, this right here, has to do with the capacity of humanity to sin. It does not refer to this. It does not refer to God's creating humanity in God's image. Original sin has to do with our capacity to sin. It has nothing to do with God's imago Dei, creating humanity in God's image. What this basically means is that sin is our capacity, which, by the way, ties into our wills. It is not describing human creation. The differences in our understanding of the capacity to sin, our wills in sinning, is fairly diverse in how we describe how exactly this interacts. However, the Christian tradition is fairly consensual over the entire tradition as to the human creation. Because original sin is not describing the creation, it's describing our capacity to sin. These two things right here are some of the most misunderstood Christian theologies, even within the church, because we confuse the essential stuff we're made out of with our wills. And that causes us to have a misunderstanding of some of our theologians. So also we misunderstand what we mean by original sin, and we equate this with an essential aspect of human creation. Original sin has nothing to do with the human creation. It has everything to do with the capacity to sin. That is very different than the human creation. And like I said, if you're confused about why I'm pointing this out, it will become really clear here in just a moment. But just recognize, these pieces of terminology, whenever I speak them, stop and evaluate what exactly we're talking about. Don't just assume that we are on the same page. Evaluate whether our understandings are meeting in the middle somewhere. And if they're not, it's my sincere apologies. But, again, Olsen's book deals with these two things in a very helpful way. But I wanted to point those out at the very beginning. Because now we're going to talk about, consensually, we're going to talk about the consensus of what Christianity has said about humanity. And depending on your experience in Christianity, whether you're new to Christianity, whether you're not a Christian, whether you have been a Christian for all your life, you may find something surprising about this. But let's examine this. What is the consensus? There are three main things that Olsen wants to point out as our consensus about Christian creation, or about the creation of humanity. The consensus is along three lines. The first is humans are both physical and spiritual. In Christianity, throughout the history of the church, humans, as we understand humanity, are not merely physical nor merely spiritual. They are both of these things, in some way, shape, or form. Here's why this is important. Because we have both a mortal physical aspect to us, which in our U.S. culture is fairly the obvious one, we have an existence that is a physical, tangible nature to us. We're things that you can touch, feel, hear, smell, be irritated at, all these various things. But we are actual entities within a physical universe. We're made up of stuff. Our body composition is made up of all kinds of different chemicals. We're a chemical thing. My skin is made up of physical things, atoms and chemicals. So we're physical things, but we are also spiritual things. Throughout Christian tradition, we have an indwelling of another essential part of us as spiritual things. You can actually see this in some way, shape, or form in the Genesis story itself, where God takes humanity, takes man, and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. Man becomes a living being after God breathes into man. Now, breath in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew word ruach, means wind. Means the breath or wind that is put into humanity. And wind is actually associated very closely with the Holy Spirit. Spirit is actually a word that we take from the word ruach, which means wind. So the Spirit being this animating force that makes humanity, that makes creation. But particularly, what we say about humanity, though, being spiritual, is in the Genesis passage as well. And it's this concept of the imago Dei. It's a funny little Latin phrase that basically means created in God's image. When God creates humanity, he looks down and says, "Let us make man in our own image." And volumes of theology have been written over trying to understand what that means. However, just like we talked about in the creation chapter a couple chapters ago, and just as we talked about in the nature of God, creation, and in God's image specifically humanity, has a specific imprint of some sort of God's own self. We are physical in that we are creation, we are other than God. However, there is something unique about humanity being created in God's image. Some theologians have argued, I think successfully, that some of this has to do with our rationality. That we have a higher capacity for rational thought. We have a complex system of rationality that has been imbued in humanity, that we would say within the Christian tradition is an aspect of the spiritual. We wouldn't say that rationality is merely a physical process. We actually say that it has a spiritual factor as well. Because rationality is another way that, within certain theological traditions, we say that God's imprint on humanity is made. We are imprinted with a rational ability. St. Thomas Aquinas actually talks about this in more Aristotelian language, Aristotle's philosophy, where rationality has different levels of rationality. Where we say that plants have a certain rationality that is lesser than animals, but animals have a lesser rationality than humanity, which has a larger rationality. However you parse that, the main thing that Christians have always agreed on is humans are both a physical and spiritual being. How exactly that is meted out mechanically has been debated, but this has been where we have landed. We're not merely physical, not merely spiritual, we're somewhere both of these. And that has been the consensual tradition of these things. And it largely revolves around the Genesis 1 and 2 passages about the Imago Dei and about the observance of rationality and how we understand human rationality. The next area is one that, again, you might be surprised depending on who you are, but for the wide swath of theology, starting all the way with Irenaeus in the early church, St. Augustine, up to John Calvin, to Martin Luther, to Ulrich Zwingli, to basically all of the major players within Christian thought have held that humans are essentially good. Now again, we have to be careful about how we talk about this. Remember when I talked about nature? Because we're going to get to this in point number 3. Nature does not equal essential substance. Because nature refers to will. Because this is a rational function. This is a function of the mind, a rational function of the spirit. Substance is referring to the stuff we're made out of. The stuff of creation. Rational use of will and the stuff we're made out of are two different things. The reason why Christian tradition, even the players that you would not expect to say this, such as St. Augustine and John Calvin, have said, and they're quoted within Olsen as saying, humans are created essentially good. Because in the original creation of humanity, when God created humanity and created the universe, God looked at it and said, it is good. And actually when he gets to humanity, he said, it is very good. Essentially, in the substance we are made out of, in the original creation of humanity, our essential parts of us, the stuff of creation, physical and spiritual, are made good. This was the original intent of God that almost invariably Christian theologians hold to. At least all of the major ones within our Christian tradition, even the ones that we don't associate with believing this. Because there is a difference between saying that humans are essentially good and humans are essentially evil. If the stuff of creation that we are made out of in the essential substance was evil, that creates problems with our understanding of God. Because again, this goes back to a dualism of God who is ultimately good, creates, we believe, after God's own nature, which is good. If God creates something of the stuff of creation that is substantively evil by its very creation, that creates problems with our understanding of God. However, we also don't attribute evil to God. Like we've said several classes in a row, undeniably within the Christian tradition, God does not cause evil. God is not the source of evil. God does not cause it. If God created an essential substance that was evil out of the stuff of creation, that would violate that particular premise. And that would create massive problems for how we understand who God is. But the reason why this is important is because we hold that in the Christian tradition, humans, in their essential stuff of creation, in the way that they are created, are imbued with the image and likeness of God in some way. 1 John even says, you say that you love God, and yet you slander your brother behind your back. If you truly love God, you would love your brother also. 1 John even has a really high idea of if you disown or disavow what God has made in God's own image, how can you say you love God? Essentially, what of course the letter of 1 John is getting at is getting back to Jesus' own words. The greatest commandments being these: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, because they are also made in the image of God. So when we talk about number 2, remember, we're talking about not our capacity of will, we're talking about our essential creation, the substance in which we are made, in which Genesis says, it is very good, as God says. Now, we get to talk about human will. Because in our essential goodness of our created stuff, we also say, because we are observers of the world, that humans are afflicted with spiritual corruption. Also, spiritual corruption or blindness. Humans are afflicted with spiritual corruption. This is where we're talking about the capacity of will. Remember when we talk about in the creation passage and in the providence passage, or in the providence chapter, we talk about when God creates something. We believe that God creates after God's own essential attributes as well. When God creates something, God doesn't create something that is evil just because it's lesser than he is. God creates a different level of goodness. He creates the universe and says it is good. However, we still say God is ultimately good, over and above the rest. But in the creation of the universe, he creates good. But also in that, we say that an essential aspect of God's own attributes is his ultimate freedom in what he chooses to do. God did not have to choose to create the universe, because God is God whether the universe exists or not. But God chose to create it. God chose freely to create it. And one of the things that we say within Christian tradition is that because God chooses to create, God also creates after his own self. There are certain things about the universe we can observe that we say are after God's own attributes because he is the creator of them. It's like if someone makes a particular project or present out of a wonderful needle stitch or after a woodworking project, and nonetheless they create after themselves. They create something that is lesser than themselves, but they create it in a very real way out of their own rationality, thought, love, care, these things, so that the thing that they create really does contain something after the person. A particular kind of willful, substantial way that this is connected to a person. God also, within the tapestry of the universe, creates after his own substance, or excuse me, creates after his own substantial will. And what happens is that because God is perfectly free, we also say that humans are imbued with a freedom. And this will, because freedom we say, the freedom to choose is an aspect of the will. And the will in humanity, we say, has been afflicted with spiritual corruption and blindness. We willfully choose the wrong. And we also are bound to choose the wrong. We undeniably seek after that which is not God. And depending on how you describe this, depending on how you closely suss this out, you will have some who will say there is complete bondage of the will, aka Martin Luther. There is a complete bondage of the will in which we cannot willfully choose good things unless God gives us the ability to. We are completely bound by our wills to choose what is evil because we will choose what is self-serving rather than serving of God and other. The will is so bound as to bend inward on itself towards our own selves rather than to bend outward towards God and neighbor. And that we say that this is an affliction of spiritual corruption. It is not an essential part of human nature. It is an affliction. It is a disease of human nature. Which is why when someone asks you if humans are essentially good or essentially evil, that is, in the Christian tradition, a false dichotomy. There is a much harder middle road that we have to walk if we want to remain faithful to the way that theology has been done in the past 2,000 years. If you don't want to pay attention to the past 2,000 years, that is totally fine. People can be wrong about this stuff. However, if you are a student of Christian history, there is necessarily a middle road between those two polarities. Which is why when we say that humans are essentially in their created stuff good, we differentiate that from saying that humans have an afflicted will. We have a spiritual disease that requires supernatural healing. We cannot do what we want to do without God's help. We cannot do the good without God's assistance. Hence, we need God. We need an outside healing other than ourselves. But throughout Christian history, these three things are the things that we have consensually, by broad agreement, understood as being common between us. The elucidation of how we understand these things have large amounts of diversity in them, especially this one, number 3, right here. In fact, Olsen, I think, helpfully points out that within Christian tradition, we never have had a universally agreed upon definition of what we mean by sin. Because rather in the creeds of which the Episcopal Church holds to as being the essentials of the faith, in the creeds we actually don't have an essential elucidation as to what sin is. Rather, we have an essential elucidation of what God has done to free us from sin and death. We can say definitively what that is, but we're careful about this for reasons that we'll get into. But just remember, number 2 has to do with the stuff we're made out of, God making us good, essentially because God creates after the goodness of himself, but that we are afflicted with spiritual corruption because of our ability of our free will to choose that which is not good for us. And what we say about this is that original sin is where this is, right here. And original sin refers to the affliction of our will. It refers to what we understand as the the common boundness of humanity to commit that which is evil. Hence, this is the reason why Jesus Christ, the Son of God, had to come and save us. If we could save ourselves, God did not need to come to us, or did not have to come to us. And what we say is that the reason why God did that is because God's own free will chose to save us even though we were bound to do what is evil. Even though we were bound to commit atrocities against God and against neighbor. Which again, that's where the gospel is right there. Jesus came to free us from the power of sin and death. But in our discussion about this, the things we have to be careful of is, again, how we understand the stuff we're made out of, the essential stuff, and our wills. Because that's where we find our alternatives. Alternatives are going to be the things that are on the razor edge or outside of the Christian tradition. And the reason why they are outside of the Christian tradition is because they violate what the consensual tradition has said about humanity. And the ones that Olsen wants to highlight are three particular ones. The first one he wants to highlight is secular humanism. Secular humanism, as it comes to how we understand humanity, is going to have several tenets that we have seen before within naturalism and within empiricism, as we talked about in the past couple of chapters. But secular humanism, as it comes to the way that we describe humanity, holds to there is no spiritual aspect of humanity There's no spiritual aspect of humanity, only physical. By and large, what secular humanism will say is that it is false to say that there is any spiritual aspect of humanity that cannot be explained by physical processes. Philosophically, this works itself out in something called physicalism. Physicalism is the belief that only that which is physical exists in the universe. Nothing that is not physical exists. There is nothing that exists that cannot be empirically tested. Physicalism is an outcome of empiricism, and empiricism says that the only things that exist are the things that can be tested. The only things that exist in the world are things that physically we can provide evidences of through specifically the scientific method. Again, the scientific method is not the same thing as secular humanism. The scientific method is a tool. Secular humanism is a metaphysical stance. Philosophically, this is working in philosophy. The physical sciences work within the observable universe. You can be a Christian scientist. You can be. Let me just say that again. You can be a Christian scientist because the scientific method is not the same thing as secular humanism. But I digress. Secular humanism says that only the physical exists. The reason why this is perhaps obviously outside of what Christians would say about this is that this violates the Imago Dei. As it comes specifically to humanism, as it comes specifically to human nature. Of course, secular humanism also has problems for how we understand God, because secular humanism will say that God does not exist. But that's not for this discussion. For this discussion, we're talking about humanity. Secular humanism, because of the way that they look at humanity, what they will say is that there is no imputed or imbued spiritual sense to us because there is only physical reality. In Christianity, obviously, we have that God animates humanity. God is the creation, or God creates humanity in God's own image, and that the concept of afterlife, even in the Christian tradition, that actually cannot exist in the form that we have it in Christianity if there's only physical reality. Hence why secular humanism, philosophically and secular humanism, the only meaning that we existentially can have is the meaning that we create ourselves during the time here, or depending on how nihilistic you are, there is no meaning that is ever objectively created. There is no meaning to the universe. There is only what's happening right now and what will happen because the universe said that it will happen. Of course, that turns the universe into an actual agent. But, again, there are several different problems with being able to associate this with any kind of Christianity. It's simply a system that is not compatible. However, we have to be careful because secular humanism, even though we say that it is not Christian, nonetheless affects the way we think about things. Physical is what we can easily observe, and hence the things that we can easily study. What secular humanism also kind of pushes away from is the inspiration of people under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, of humanity being able to choose the good only because God allows us to choose it, but also that humanity can choose the good in and above their own faculties. Hence why we say that Scripture is inspired. We don't simply say that humans are only physical beings making only physical choices, making only physical choices based upon their culture or their ethnicity or their position in the world. We actually say that because they're spiritual, they have access to a higher faculty. There is a higher ability of use within humanity beyond only the physical. The other thing that this creates a problem with is this creates a problem with utilitarianism, that by utility is the only moral aspect that we have in the world, which is a common thing that secular humanism will say. This is where we get the origin of something called the trolley problem, which is you have a trolley that has two bends in it, and you're standing holding the lever. One lever has 16 people tied up on the rail, and one lever has one person. Which rail do you choose, and why do you choose it? Someone's going to die either way. This was actually a thought experiment to show how ridiculous utilitarianism is. But if utility is the only thing that we have in our moral compass, and it's only physical, this lends credence to the ability that we're just making it up as we go along. We only imbue things with meaning as they come, which is why existentially, secular humanism is a robust philosophy that is very stringent within the academy. However, secular humanism is not compatible with humanity because it violates what we believe is an essential moral aspect and requirement of ourselves for our neighbors. It's not that secular humanists don't have a way of caring for neighbor. It's that the particular philosophical way we get there requires that there's only physical, whereas in Christianity we believe that there is both physical and spiritual implications for these things. So that's the first alternative. And as you can probably tell, some of the things that we have discussed in previous chapters are coming back in different forms because, again, theology and philosophy are part and parcel of the whole thing. When you mess with one part of it, you mess with another part of it. You have entire philosophical and theological systems that are incompatible with each other because they have particular positions on essential things that we as Christians confess and that others confess in opposition to it. It's just a function of the way that we work in logic. But the second one, now Olsen calls it neo-Gnosticism. I'm not a huge fan of neo-Gnosticism. Just call it Gnosticism. I'm going to call it neo-Gnosticism because that's what Olsen calls it. But Gnosticism is really kind of what he's getting at. That Gnosticism comes back in different forms. But what is Gnosticism? Here's what Gnosticism says. Gnosticism is associated with there only being one substance in the universe. So there's only one substance in the cosmos, and that substance is God. And that substance is also spiritual only. And the reason why this creates problems is because when God creates humanity, God forms us out of stuff. the indwelling spiritual aspect of humanity, we say in the Christian tradition, is not the only real stuff. Whereas Gnosticism, in the way that we at least can observe in historic Gnosticism and in ways that it kind of shows back up, is that because of the idea that there is one substance in the cosmos, that one substance is God, and God simply emanates out of his own substance into the world, therefore we in humanity are of one substance with God. We talked about how that particular idea of creation creates problems when we as humans commit evil acts, because does that mean that God's own physical substance is evil? That's a question we have. But what this also does is it bifurcates. If there's only one substance, that substance is spiritual, what do we do with the physical? Or as some of our scriptures would say, what do we do with the flesh? Or the body? And the reason why this is really important is because of Jesus Christ. If the flesh and the body are by their essential aspects non-real or non-good things, when Jesus becomes incarnate, that would make no sense. In fact, Gnosticism held that Jesus only spiritually was present and wasn't physically present. Jesus didn't really die physically on the cross. He only seemed to die while his spirit was unaffected by the physical means of the universe. Hence, the physical being associated with evil, and the spiritual being associated with good. We are to utterly deny our bodies, our flesh, our physical nature, and we are to search only after the spiritual, the hiddenness of God. This creates problems because God said pretty explicitly that in the essential stuff of creation, again, the substance is referring to creation or essential. The creation or essential stuff that God made the universe out of was called good by God. And so this bifurcation that sometimes comes up in neo-Gnosticism or in Gnosticism as understood, that there's only one substance in the cosmos, the reason why that creates problems is because it creates problems even with the way we understand our bodies and our physical substance. If we say that our stuff is by essential aspects evil, the way that we treat those who commit evil, arguably, this may be a stretch, but moralistically, if we only understand the evil that we commit as being an essential nature to ourselves, we treat people very much more like animals than we treat them like people that have imbued wills. This can be argued, but if you only see humanity as being something that is evil in and of its own nature, you will treat people differently. And you will treat people with a lesser humanity than is due them by God who made them. And even though neo-Gnosticism has a high understanding of the spirit, this can be incredibly oppressive if we view certain kinds of physical material as having lesser value than others. Hence, you can read anything about the racism within the 16th through 20th century and look at the arguments that are made that bifurcate people into spiritual and physical. I'll give you a guess as to what the physical aspects of that are treated as evil. The color black was treated as a physical sign of evil or lesserness, which is abhorrent to the rest of the Christian tradition. Hence, I think it's quite the irony that St. Augustine, the guy that so influenced Western Christian tradition, was an African man. We owe a huge portion of our theology to an African man, which I think is justified. But the thing is that Gnosticism will create a bifurcation in that way, and it is dangerous as it comes to our moral responsibility for each other. And so that's where neo-Gnosticism gets in real big trouble. and it might not seem that way at the outset, but when we bifurcate the substances when we bifurcate the physical from the spiritual, where the physical is merely an evil thing and the spiritual is a good thing, that is open to all kinds of abuse as it comes to our ability to adjudicate what kinds of substances are evil. And that usually is driven by those who have the most say in the conversation. However, that's why we need to really be careful with Gnosticism, and why the Christian tradition has been historically really careful with the way that we describe our nature. The other one is one that we know a lot better, I think, even if you don't know his name. Pelagianism. It's a funny word, but Pelagianism refers to a monk from the British Isles named Pelagius, who taught that when infants are born, that infants are born with what philosophers would refer to as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. This is a later terminology, but Pelagius existed during the time of St. Augustine. And Augustine wrote against Pelagius a lot, which is where you get the concept of original sin from in Augustine's rebuttal of Pelagius. But what Pelagianism essentially says is that when humans are born into the world, they are born with a blank slate. They are born without a capacity to sin. They do not have an imbued sinfulness in them. Therefore, pastorally, what Pelagius was trying to do was actually very good. What Pelagius was trying to do was answer the question, if infants are born and you have a death of an infant, if you have the tragedy of child mortality, which by the way was a whole bunch higher in their particular time than in our time. But if they have infant mortality, and we say that infants have died, how can we say that God condemns them for an imputed sin within them without them even having the ability to choose to learn the rationality to choose otherwise? Pelagius answered this by saying that human babies are actually born blank slates. They do not actually make a decision that makes them guilty when they are born. They come out without having an essential sinfulness to them. Now again, here's where we get into a problem with nature and essentials. Because one of the things that, while that is good, while that is something that you can get at with other kinds of theology, what that does is it does something actually a little, it does something very subtle, but it does something which unravels a little bit of other theology, which is that when Pelagianism says that we're born with a blank slate, what this is saying, excuse me, I was about to ask a question there. What Pelagianism basically says is that humans can be perfect without God. Now, this concept is something that needs explained. When Pelagius writes this, again, he's responding to a pastoral circumstance. And it may sound cruel to you that Augustine writes back and develops more explicitly the concept of original sin in response to this. However, Augustine does not say that infants are condemned to damnation if they die. Augustine, and actually throughout the Christian tradition, most theologians will actually say that. However, they don't get at it through humans can be perfect without God. Humans are created as a tabula rasa. Rather, Augustine explains how infant mortality is a tragedy and is therefore sanctified by the action of Jesus Christ on their behalf. That Jesus Christ, who came to save even the worst of sinners, also came to save those who did not have the ability to make any choices in life to begin with. So Augustine reroutes this back to a theology of Jesus and what the action of Jesus' salvation on the cross did, rather than Pelagius focusing on this problem as a human question. So, categorically, Pelagius and Augustine answered that question in different categories. The reason why Augustine is so concerned about this is because when we observe human interaction, we do not see this acting in our wills. Augustine responds, so Augustine's ad contra to this is that this is not something we observe. Humans do not seem to want to be perfect. They don't seem to want to desire what God desires. And Augustine actually says that the reason why original sin is so important is because original sin explains something that this does not. Which is that original sin explains our bound will. Because let's think about this logically. Humans can be perfect without God, while innocent enough as it comes to infants. When we observe humanity, I'll observe myself actually. Let me just put myself out there. I did not have to be taught to disobey my parents. My parents can agree to this. I didn't have to learn that. That was an innate part of myself that I could choose in my freedom to do that which is not good for me. But not just that, but that our bound will to do that which only is self-serving is something that Augustine says is not an essential human aspect. It is an affliction of our humanity. It's basically, Augustine was so concerned with this is because basically what was happening is we were saying that humans are not afflicted, that the disease is not there. Whereas Augustine said that there are plenty of ways that we can explain and say there are symptoms of a really awful disease that we're part of, and it is not good for us to just explain this away by an appeal to humanity. Rather, Augustine explains this by appealing to the goodness of Jesus on our behalf, which is different than saying that humanity can do it without God. Excuse me. And Augustine, which I should say, this is Augustine. The reason why original sin is so important is because it is an explanatory way that we explain what we're observing. As much as it is an ideal circumstance for us to think that the innocent child that we have is in fact innocent, any parent can tell you they don't have to be taught to disobey you. I'll at least speak about it in my own kind of circumstance. I did not have to be taught to disobey. Rather, there is a boundedness of my will that is something I am afflicted with. But it is not an essential part of my being. If it was an essential part of humanity, Jesus could not have taken on humanity. This is something theologians have mused about. When Jesus took on our humanity, what Jesus said was that humanity has an essential goodness that is not bound completely to an essential ability to sin. Sin is not an essential part of humanity. It is an affliction of humanity in which Jesus was coming to save us from. Again, the difference between nature and creation and the stuff we're made out of. Nature is not the same thing as our creation. Tell me if you've heard me say that in this class so far. But Pelagianism, while for good, like I said, all theology is done with good intention. All theology is done with trying to get at something important. However, what does what we say about the human category messing with something essential in another? Again, Pelagius answered this by appealing to humanity. Augustine answered this by appealing to a part of Jesus' action salvifically. They answered this in different ways. And the reason why they answered in different ways is for essential things that violate what we say that we observe. So, there you go. There's what Pelagianism is. There's a reason why we say in the Book of Common Prayer Whenever we take on our baptismal vows, I will with God's help, baptism is a call, not of our own will. God calls us to baptism. It's not our own bright idea. So these are the alternatives. Let's talk about the diversity. And I'm going to talk about this, pretty short because I've spent a lot of time on the other ones. The diversity in Christian tradition has to do with how we understand how humans are physical and spiritual. And specifically, it has to do with how we understand spirituality in what we see in biblical text. These are going to be really, really confusing sounding, but they're not too confusing, I promise. They're just confusing language. They're also confusing to spell. Now, all of these are metaphysical understandings of the human spirit. Easy for me to say. Dichotomic dualism is a reference to how we understand humans, the stuff humans is made out of. This one is the dominant one in the Christianity. Dichotomic dualism say that humans are made up of body and soul. Hence, dichotomic dualism. Humans are made up of body and soul. Body and soul, and dualism, they're not the same thing. So the dichotomic means that there's body and soul. The dualism means that body and soul are not the same substance. They are bodies and souls put together in some way, shape, or form that are, in fact, part and parcel of the human being, but can be separated and still have a human being. Hence, Platonism, and to a lesser extent, the way that Christians have thought about heaven is that although the body may die, the soul lives on. The body dies, is laid in the ground, the soul ascends to heaven where God is. That is a classic understanding of dichotomic dualism as it comes to the resurrection. When the resurrection happens at the last day, the body is resurrected anew to be reunited with the soul. That's a general idea of how to understand that. That's kind of almost it's almost an inherited idea of heaven that a lot of us walk around with. But this is one idea that affects the way that we understand death. That if we have a dichotomic dualism understanding of the soul and the body, when we die, our body rests, our soul ascends to where God is, and then at the resurrection of the dead at the last day, the body is resurrected anew to be reunited with the soul. Lots of disagreement over that, but that is one outcome of dichotomic dualism. That's one. Trichotomy, says there are three essential parts of humanity, which is body, soul, and spirit. Body, soul, spirit. Trichotomy. And what we are saying in this is that whereas dichotomic dualism will combine soul and spirit into just soul or spirit, there's only, like the soul is the same thing as the spirit. Trichotomy will say that body, soul, and spirit are distinct from each other. Body, soul, spirit being, body, the physical stuff, obviously, soul and spirit being two different things. One way that this is sometimes explained is that soul is what we have as a created human. We have a soul within us. Even Plato and Aristotle would say that plants and animals have a certain kind of soul in them. They have a plant soul and animal soul. We have a human soul. But that the spirit is something that we necessarily are given in order to have real eternal life. Hence the giving of the spirit. Human spirit being something that is dead until the coming of the Holy Spirit. Body, soul, spirit, trichotomy. Again, that's one way it works itself out, not all of them. Holism is something that avoids this altogether. And it says this. Well, excuse me. I'm going to use a more philosophical term. This says humans are soul bodies. Holism would say there is no ability to bifurcate physical from spiritual, physical from soul. It is one thing. Therefore, humans are soul bodies. You can't separate the soul from the body nor the body from the soul, and if you do that, you don't get a human anymore. Is basically what this would say. Holism is an attempt to recapture a less mechanical view of humanity, mechanical is probably the best way to understand it. Is that through my marker? Mechanical is probably the best way to understand that. Basically what they're saying is that there are not parts of the human that are inessential to each other. The physical is essential for the spiritual is essential for the physical. It's a reciprocal relationship rather than a divided relationship. Holism tries to get back at this idea that when Christ was resurrected, Christ was not just a spirit wandering around. Christ was an imbued body that was moving around in a spiritual sense. As the resurrection appearances would prove, that's not just any body. That is one heck of a body that can appear out of thin air, disappear into thin air, be in different locations all at once, and nonetheless still be a physical presence. Jesus asks for fish to eat on the side of the Sea of Galilee when he sees his disciples. He eats physically what they've set in front of him, and yet he also is able to do these amazing things in a resurrected body. And what holism tries to do is it tries to hold together the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ with a more key aspect of souls and spirit not being divided from bodies. That there is an essential part to bodies, physical, that is imbued with soul, and vice versa. Those are where your main three are going to come in. There are all kinds of disagreement over this, because all of these have to answer where does sin come from. So where is sin in this relationship? Again, if we say that sin is in body, are we just reverting to Gnosticism? Are we saying that spirit is good, body is bad? If we say that sin is in the soul, how are we to understand the spirit being breathed in us as having sin within it? Again, this is usually where we'll locate sin because of an aspect of our will, our rationality to sin, rather than an essential part of us. But again, where are we afflicted? Are we afflicted in body? Are we afflicted in soul? Are we afflicted in spirit? Are we afflicted in all of it? The answer that most Christians will give is we're afflicted in all of it. But how exactly that works out is worked out in different ways in these three particular thoughts. But again, we're going to return to what is essentially where we need to move forward in unity. Which again, Olsen is treating unity. Olsen treats unity as an adherence to our four places we find our evidence from, which is our little acronym REST. We find it in Scripture, in tradition, in experience, and in reason. So, in the unitive movement for Christian tradition, Olsen says we need to have unity around the essential aspects of what we say about humanity rather than getting into either-or challenges. The unity for Olsen is that humanity is both good and fallen. Again, good as it pertains to our essential creation, and fallen as it comes to the exercise of our wills. We have to hold these two in tension, Olsen argues, because while this is something that can get into intense debate, what Olsen again says is that this is the paradox of where we find ourselves in Christian theology. We don't say that these two, we don't say that humanity is both good and evil, because again, fallen implies that there is original goodness that we are held to. Rather, we say that we are both good in our essential creation because God creates after his own goodness, and fallen in that our wills, the thing that we choose to do, are bound to sin because of the explanation of original sin. Original sin is not the only way to understand this, but original sin also is not only tied to just one narrow interpretation of original sin. Original sin tries to get at what is the boundedness of our will to choose to do the wrong. And it has to do with human freedom, which again, human freedom has been written over for the past 3,000, 4,000 years, and we still don't have a unitive idea as to what we mean by freedom. You can actually look up psychology and see how complex the idea of freedom is, and what do we mean by freedom. But essentially what Olsen says is that we need to hold these two together. And if we hold these two together, we'll be walking the harder but better middle way between the polarities. One side will say that humans are good, and wills are unbent. And one side will say humans are evil. So, again, when we say humans are good, what do you mean by that? In our essential createdness, yes. As it comes to our wills, no. Humans are evil. As it comes to our bent wills to choose to do that which is wrong, yes. Humans are essential evil? Actually, no. Because God says it is good, and Jesus incarnates as a human. There is an essential aspect to the goodness of created humanity that both of these miss. Olsen says we don't need that one and we don't need this one. Rather, we need here. We need somewhere in here. And that's where he says this is. We need to hold together both of the true theological statements for Christianity, that humanity is both good and fallen. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion of the Mosaic of Christian Theology. Please do check out our previous videos, which are uploaded both on our Facebook site and on our YouTube site. All of these things build on each other, and so if you have a question about humanity, you might actually find it in our creation chapter, or in our chapters about God, or in our chapters about salvation. So please do check those out. All of these things build on each other, and they provide some really helpful insight into how humanity is an essential theological place where we do our reflection as Christians. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you in the service of Holy Eucharist in just a few minutes.